You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
So we can get ahead of this in a lot of ways by elevating the practice, by supporting skill building, and that is not something that's hard to do. I mean, I've given many different training sessions with supervisors who have been in the academy for 20 years, and the main comment I get is, why didn't anyone tell me this?
Hello and welcome to Campus Talks, the podcast from Times Higher Education that offers insight and advice on all aspects of the global university sector. I'm Eliza Compton, Deputy Editor of Campus. Today's topic is one that will be familiar to many members of the Academy, whether because they have done it themselves or perhaps just through their own experience of completing a PhD or master's program. Yes, we're talking about graduate supervision. The role of supervisor is complex, one that spans pedagogy, project management, emotional support, pathfinding and cultural awareness, as well as disciplinary rigour. With high stakes, enriching when it goes well, destructive when it doesn't. So given that, I was surprised to learn from my guest that many scholars come to research supervision armed with only their own experience of being supervised. Part of her mission is to change that and advocate for professional development in supervision for the benefit of students, academics, institutions, and higher education's mission of creating and disseminating knowledge. Katerina Standish is a Professor of Global and International Studies, Interim Dean of the Faculty of Indigenous Studies, Social Sciences and Humanities, and Vice-provost academic at the University of Northern British Columbia in Canada. She was previously the director of the Arthur V. Morrow Institute for Peace and Justice at St Paul's College at the University of Manitoba and director of research and senior lecturer at the National Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Otago in New Zealand. Her postgraduate teaching and research background draws on knowledge of Western and Indigenous research frameworks, and she is a certified conflict coach. Katerina's many books cover conflict transformation, peace education, genocide and human rights, among other topics. But it's her next one that we're talking about today. The Graduate Supervisors Handbook, Practical Strategies for Graduate Pedagogy and Practice, will be published in June. Designed to be a toolkit, in 116 pages, it reframes supervision as a pedagogical practice requiring intentionality, structure and care. I loved this wide-ranging conversation with Katerina as we really dug into the foundational principles of good supervision, practical skills, what to do when things don't go to plan, and what universities can do to improve the dearth of training opportunities for new and seasoned supervisors. So let's hear from Katerina. Hi Katerina and welcome to Campus Talks.
Good morning, Liza. How are you?
I am very well and very pleased to be speaking to you about graduate supervision. I know you're going to have lots of advice and insight for us as someone who has overseen, I think, 26 PhDs to completion and many master's students, as well as being an advocate for professional development for graduate supervisors and the author of an upcoming book, the Graduate Supervisors Handbook, Practical Strategies for Graduate Pedagogy and Practice. My first question for you is, what are the skills that are required for good graduate supervision?
Well, I think that the skills that are required for good graduate supervision are not necessarily things that just arrive on their own. It's not also just an extension of disciplinary expertise. So the most important skills are relational and interpretive rather than technical. I think supervisors need to be able to listen very carefully. They need to be able to read academic work generously and critically, and they need to respond in ways that move thinking forward rather than close it down. But equally important for a good supervisor is expectation setting and what I'll call boundary work. So making implicit norms explicit, negotiating the roles of supervision, timelines, standards, and then also revisiting those agreements as the supervision project evolves. They also need, of course, emotional attunement and recognizing when a candidate is struggling intellectually, professionally, or personally, and knowing where to direct them when that does happen. What often surprises new supervisors is how much supervision relies on judgment, not rules. Knowing what to say, when to leave things alone, and when things absolutely need to be addressed. And all of these kinds of skills are things that are rarely taught, unfortunately, in the academy. And it's one of the things that I'm hoping to support our colleagues to do better in my work.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've got programs, I think, at the University of Northern British Columbia to support this work.
Yeah, so one of the things that I've benefited from personally and professionally is working in a postgraduate center. So the majority of the students that I've been supervising for the bulk of my academic career are masters and PhDs. That's a bit of a boot camp when a lot of other people tend to sort of spend their time very gradually working from an undergraduate support mechanism, maybe an honors thesis or directed study, and then they maybe do a few masters and, maybe be 2 to 3 or 4 PhDs in the first sort of 10 years of their career. What happened to me was I got to see very, very quickly what good supervision does for students and what not good supervision does for students and for their progress. So from my experience being in that kind of an intensive and having multiple co-supervisors, secondary supervisors, primary supervisors who were different from me, I did find that it was an opportunity for me to look analytically at what we were doing and what we weren't doing. And there are so many opportunities to professionalize what we do in supervision. And it always surprises me. In most universities, you will have a center for teaching and learning. In some places, you'll have a center for teaching, learning, and technology. But I've yet to see a center for teaching, learning, technology, and supervision.
Yeah, because it's not quite pedagogy, is it? I mean, it is like that's a large part of it, and the subtitle of your book includes pedagogy. But there's also, as you said, there's so many aspects to it. So there's an emotional aspect, there's a project management aspect to it, there's obviously academic expertise and rigor,
Yeah, yeah,
institutional responsibility.
absolutely. Yeah. And
It's
no one would expect a new supervisor to know any of this.
right.
Most of us come to supervision having experienced it ourselves, and that's a very small toolkit. People that supervise in larger faculties have the opportunity to observe how other people do it. If you end up on committees, if you're doing work with other academics, you might see, and most of us learn by what feels right and what feels wrong, but a lot of us, don't necessarily have the support to even ask questions. At the University of Northern British Columbia, one of the things that I did last year was create learning tools for our supervisors to professionally develop themselves. And that includes everything from understanding the basics of supervision pedagogy to understanding the institutional requirements of their role in the university and how many support groups there are that they weren't necessarily aware of. And then the third part of the training module has to do with when things go wrong. And my basic underlying framework of the entire training module is plan, pause, and pivot if necessary. Supervision, I think, is aided in many, many ways by a very, very structured and intentional process. Nobody goes to the first class they're going to teach without a syllabus. So this is an opportunity to start strong, adjust if needed. Life happens. Everybody who's done a PhD supervision knows you have absolutely no idea if it's going to take 3 years in the UK model or 5 in the Canadian. Things happen. Babies get born, divorces, marriages, there's immigration issues, there's all kinds of things that factor in. Nobody knows how to do a PhD when you're doing it for the first time. The supervisor does, though. So this is the guide, the guide posting bit and the wayfinding tool that a supervisor can be. Getting people to focus on what's important now. I'll tell you what's around the corner, but this is the broader view. And then we can talk about goals and expectations of the student along the line. For instance, in our training, we have worksheets that we give to supervisors to talk about professional development with their students. What does the student want to get out of their university degree? We know the academic path is minimal. We know that there are so-called alt-ac avenues that people need. And we also know that we need to be training our students, not simply to be disciplinary experts, but to be people that are very, very highly skilled and sought after in terms of their own professional careers.
You're setting a student up for potentially an academic career, potentially an industry career. You're giving them a sense of themselves as a scholar. I wanted to get a sense then at this point in the conversation of what the stakes are. So what are the costs of supervision that goes poorly?
Well, I always say that the benefit of being a bad supervisor is no one wants you to supervise. Now, this is not necessarily a good outcome, and it's certainly not a good outcome for students. So for a supervisor, though, most of us who have been in supervision for a long period of time consider it one of our most beneficial activities, and it actually gives us the most job satisfaction for what we do. We are literally shepherding people from one stage of their academic acumen into another, and we are watching growth as it happens, and we are able to create our peers. It's a wonderful thing to experience when you have someone who comes into the discipline, whatever it may be. But the stakes are very high if a person experiences graduate supervision poorly. It will affect someone's confidence. It will affect their ability to network. It will affect their ability to feel confident in what their contribution is. And also it limits their ability to understand the value of post-secondary education and the value of graduate study, which is a very unique form of study. And it's something that really sets an individual up to be an independent learner and someone capable of being very astute in their communication. Because it isn't just what we do as academics, it's how we share that with the world. And whether that dissemination is something we do in community, whether it's something we do in academic publication or in conferences or seminars or, public facing intellectualism, whatever it is, the ability to capture what it is that we know or what we discovered and then share it in a way that is meaningful to others is an enormous benefit for society, because we are a knowledge society. And being a knowledge worker as an academic, allowing somebody else to be part of that discovery and to articulate it in such a way that aligns with the practices in the academy, it's an enormously beneficial thing, but also it's truly destructive thing if it's done poorly. If you have a supervisor who communicates without expectations, if they're just a cheerleader and they don't give guidelines, the beginning, as I always say, is where you need to do the planning the most. Then there's this sort of, I call it the swimming stage, where your student is reading and figuring out what their gap is and understanding how it is that they're going to, navigate the research question, whatever it is, in whatever methodology they're using, whatever research paradigm, whether it's Western canon or Indigenous, or whether it's using qualitative or quantitative data, or whatever methodology they're using. These are things that require deep thinking and choice. And choice happens when you have the freedom to learn about many different things. So in supervision experiences where students have a supervisor who has one skill and they are not necessarily comfortable pivoting into something else, that can be a diminishment of the opportunity, because then the student doesn't have the ability to make choices. There's no one way to do supervision, but bad supervision tends to be characterized by a sense of encouragement rather than direction, a sense of happenstance rather than planning, and a sense of communication as the decision making of the supervisor rather than the supervisee. And powerlessness comes into this a lot. If you have a plan and you talk about when you're going to be writing responses to your student, and then you stick to it, that builds trust. But if we can come to that agreement in advance, then that's something that we can support in terms of future good supervision. I hope that answered your question.
It does. Given that supervision does include a whole load of different skills and capabilities and aspects, if you were a new graduate supervisor coming into that, where would you see is the most important place to start developing your skills?
I think you start to develop those skills when things go wrong.
Right.
In all instances, in a professional career, you're going to learn more from your mistakes than your successes. And one of the great gifts of failure is that you can start to anticipate where things are going to go pear-shaped. So in terms of being a new supervisor, be aware that you're not going to be perfect and that you're not expected to. The number one thing I recommend all new supervisors do is pause. Don't do anything quickly. think deeply about what you're doing, interview your prospective supervisees, spend a lot of time understanding what that connection could possibly be and what your contribution can possibly be for two reasons. Number one, I don't think academics think enough about capacity. If you have a certain golden number of students you can take on as a supervisor, don't take more than that. Understand that your contribution to them is more deep and meaningful if you are not spread too thin. The second thing is understanding that you're going to have a 3 to 6 year relationship with this person. Are they in the same city as you? Are they across the world? What kind of things are going to get in the way of you having that supervision connection? What kind of challenges might come up? And then more importantly, the sense of, are you able to contribute to what that individual is hoping for? And a lot of these people that come and ask you to supervise don't know what they're looking for. So ask them, pause. You might get a form letter that's sent out to 15 different universities if someone's looking for supervision. When I was a master's coordinator, when I was a research director, the first thing I would do whenever there was a query is ask the student, why this? Why you? Why here? Why now? Think deeply and ask the potential supervisee questions so they start to think deeply about what they're doing. I don't think that we have to just say yes to everything. And if we've gone through the process of really taking the time to get to know the potential supervisee, what we can then do is start to showcase to them that we are deliberate and thoughtful, and what we're going to do with them is going to be intentional. And it's going to be growth oriented. I'm going to have expectations of my supervisee. They are going to have expectations of me. Let's negotiate that at the beginning so that we can get around sort of mismatched expectations. And this relates to culture, this relates to gender, this relates to age, this relates to life circumstances, territoriality, everything. So pause, take a minute, and then, deeply plan what it is that you're going to do. Because if you have that plan, you might diverge from it. Things don't always work out, but you have that plan and it allows you to pivot if you need to in the future.
Mm.
And ideally, institutions will start doing more things like we do at UMBC, where we have a supervision cafe. And, we meet once a month with anybody who's doing supervision at the university. And it's a dialogue space, but more than that, it's community support. We're there simply to create a community of practice interested and concerned with how things happen and if they go well. If you're a new supervisor and you've got the opportunity to join a supervision cafe, that's what I'm going to recommend. You are going to hear stories that are going to make your toes curl. You are going to go away with a blink in your eye wondering how these things have happened. But you're also going to be exposed to the breadth of experience that you yourself are not going to have. Somebody who supervises people at a graduate level in nursing, for instance, you're largely going to have professional practitioners who have very limited time, or they may have very, very clear guidelines on what they're supposed to do because their program is credentialed. So somebody who's supervising in those kinds of programs is going to have a very different experience than somebody who's supervising, say, in history or English. So I don't want to paint everybody with the same brush, but if you're a new supervisor in a university, build your own network of mentorship. If you do not have a large department, and this is true around the world, we used to have, departments of 10, 15, 20 faculty members. Now some have 3, some have 2. And it becomes really, really difficult when you're in that insular space to say, well, am I allowed to seek out more mentorship? Some universities create academic mentors, but let's be real, those don't always work the way you think they're going to. And the great benefit of learning to supervise from people that have failed is that you get to step around the puddles a little bit yourself.
It sounds like there's an element too of self-reflection that is coming into this in terms of whether or not you take on a particular candidate and how you go about supervising. How much then does culture come into this? You sort of mentioned it briefly, but I'd like to dig into that just a little bit more, especially because I know that your background is also framed in Western, framed in Indigenous backgrounds. So how much does the supervisor's culture, institutional culture, and obviously the candidate's culture all kind of come together to influence how the supervision or the research journey might go?
So culture shapes supervision at every level. Institutionally, cultures of productivity, risk, care, compliance, they all influence what's valued in supervision and how much time and recognition it receives. So at the interpersonal level, supervisors and candidates' cultural, disciplinary, linguistic, educational background, they shape expectations about authority, feedback, independence, communication. But one of the sort of recurring themes in the book that I wrote is that many supervision tensions arise not from incompetence, but unspoken cultural assumptions. So good supervision requires cultural reflexivity and awareness of one's own defaults and a willingness to negotiate rather than assume a shared understanding. So culture, in terms of the institutional culture, is it a collectivity? Are they all trying to work for the student together? Or do you have silos? Is it really hard for the research office to speak to the registrar? Are there good websites where people can self-navigate if they need to? Or are there navigators who can help students and advise them? Institutional culture is a big part of it. Because the supervisor cannot do it alone. They are not the only person responsible for getting that student to completion. There's an entire institution to do that. The other aspect that I think affects a lot of us who work in international supervision is that we have cultural expectations based on our own backgrounds, and then we have the cultural expectations of our students, and they do not match up as much as you think they might. You will find many different reasons for silence, many different reasons for a supervisor expecting that their communication is being received on the other end appropriately. And we have this concept of low and high context cultures where what is said is more important versus what is not said is more important. And culture also means shared expectations. Building a culture of trust means building a culture of shared understanding. And so when we talk about culture and the culture of the university and the culture of research, disciplines are definitely cultural spaces. If you've worked in interdisciplinary work, or if you're someone who comes from a discipline that is extremely, rigid or well-defined or very, very old versus one of the sort of new disciplines or sub-disciplines that's out there. And I speak from experience on this because a colleague of mine is an art historian. And when she received her literature review, she got a binder from her supervisor with 18 sources at the top of 18 pages. And her literature review was supposed to be those 18 sources. And I almost cried when I heard that, because my PhD is in peace and conflict studies. And I think I went through about 130 different sources because my field is not as coherent. It's a bit of a big tent discipline. So there's a lot of different aspects that I needed to understand in order to contribute to the discipline. And all those kinds of expectations are culture. So if you have a particular, background and you have a shared understanding with people in that discipline of what it is, remind yourself that your student doesn't have that understanding. They don't know who the voices are that are important. And that's one of your goals as a supervisor, is to sort of bring them into the party. And I always say that disciplines are like cocktail parties. You don't just walk into a cocktail party and start shouting. You wait, you get to know who's already there, you listen. And so all these kinds of academic skills, I would say, of listening and skills of being analytical and being, in a way, creative. These are things that you will grow into as a scholar, but as a supervisor, you will be able to help someone else do that too. And you can start going, you know what? I know the answer to that, but you don't. Let me help you find out your own answer to that.
Because culture is something that surrounds us, a bit like if you're underwater, it surrounds you, but you can't see it. That mismatches in this area would be the thing that surface the differences. Are there ways to do that before you find that things are not quite gelling or matching up? How do you kind of tune your antenna into where it might be?
So this is the thing also about planning. So when you are in the planning stage with your student, you're going to pre-arrange together how often you're going to meet and what the purpose of those meetings is going to be. One of the easiest ways to understand that there's maybe a cultural issue is when people go silent. People tend to go silent after they've been struggling for quite a while, and they do not feel that they can engage productively. And there is a hierarchical aspect to supervision. So many students, because of their cultural background, will not put their hand up and say, I'm struggling. So it will be the responsibility of a supervisor to make sure that check-ins occur regularly and that you can discern whether, silence is because productivity, because they're very, very busy doing something and they'll come up for air when they're ready, or if they're really struggling with something. And, I've worked with supervisors who believe you just have to let them sink or swim. It's up to them. It's an independent degree. I'm not bothering. They can reach out to me. And I've worked with supervisors who have meetings with their students every single week. There is a wide range on what's required. And the truth is, you're going to have to renegotiate that with every single student. Because even if you have so-called, cultural ideas about somebody, you don't actually know them. You still have to take the time to figure out. And by the way, they have to get to know you. One of the things that I've learned as a Western scholar, my ability to be clear will rest on my ability to discern whether it has been received by the other person. I may think I've said something clearly, but I always end every email with, does that make sense to you? If this doesn't make sense to you, please allow me to say it in a different way. So you do a little bit of the heavy lifting in terms of negotiating those kinds of off-ramps for students, but it's really important for you never to ever assume that your communication is being received. Check. It only takes a second. And the truth is that I often find that students get very good at reading between the lines, but that doesn't mean they're right. It means they're doing double work. They're trying to understand somebody else's perspective. And also, let's not forget, most students go through doctoral study and master's degrees with other students. If they have the same supervisor and one person's getting one story and one person's getting another, they will talk. So it's very important for you to pause and get your needs clear as a supervisor so that you can both communicate, check communication. I mean, if you're speaking about culture, there are some things that will simply require you to be observant and respectful. For instance, when I worked in the Middle East, it was important for male supervisors to always keep the door open if they had a female supervisee. Like, there are some cultural protocols that you will absolutely need to incorporate into what you're doing, but the easiest way to do that, I think, as a supervisor, is to say, what would you be most comfortable with? Would you like the door open or shut? Would you like to have this meeting with a colleague? Would you like to bring somebody? There are all kinds of things that are possible.
You've mentioned co-supervision. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
My own practice in supervision has largely been, as much as I could, to co-supervise. That means that the student doesn't simply have one person they can talk to, they have two. And I have found that co-supervision is extremely good for the supervisor, because you have a colleague who one of them is going to be more experienced than the other. You have a colleague that you can sort of debrief with and plan with before those meetings, and it means that your student has two people who are supporting them, two people to possibly mentor, and two people to support the progress of their work. So that's a deliberate choice of me as a supervisor, that I prefer co-supervision versus primary, secondary, or committee based. And so those are the things that help a supervisor manage culture as well, because we are showing you that our culture is about collegiality, it's about transparency, and it's about continually supporting the student to progress their work. And that's different from, some people's experience of supervision, which is that it's all for the student to do all the things. I know people who have said that they've done an entire PhD and had 3 emails from their supervisor.
Right.
That said, I did bring up boundary setting at the beginning of this conversation, and I am very, very, very seriously supportive of boundary setting. I don't think you should be modeling behavior with your student that means they need to be emailing you at 2 a.m. I think it's very appropriate for you to say, these are the hours that I'm going to be available, and not be available on the other hours. We have this joke in academic, we call this the Friday data drop. Where a student is expected to have a meeting with you in the next week, and so you end up getting, I don't know, 600 pages or something on Friday from 5 different students. And I always say to my supervisees, I don't read on the weekend. If you want me to comment meaningfully on anything that you've written, you'll need to be emailing it to me on Monday. But many supervisors don't think they can say no or have boundaries. And I think for life work balance, and I think for positive professional development for yourself and for your student, you need to start modeling boundary setting. And that's the other thing about planning. When you get to that planning stage at the beginning, that's where you can ask the supervisee, when are you taking holidays? Or I'm going to be on sabbatical. Let's talk about who's going to be filling in for me if I'm gone, or something like that, right? So the idea of putting things out there that give us the ability to pause and give us the ability to have some restorative space, modeling that for my student means I expect that for them as well.
Yeah.
That they are not simply brains on sticks moving forward full force towards this end goal. Do what you can do, but at the same time, factor in that being someone who is professionally astute at graduate supervision also means understanding that you are modeling for them from the beginning of the supervision till the end, and what kind of professional practice you think is appropriate. Boundary setting is very important.
This sounds a lot to me like when I moved into managing people, there was a lot of unspoken things that you recognize as being good practice, but you don't actually know how to put them into practice yourself, which perhaps is why you wrote the book, the Graduate Supervisors Handbook. Was it that, to put it down on paper to give a framework of important skills like boundary setting, like being clear in communication, that are going to make sure that you have a functioning, sustainable relationship for however many years the relationship lasts?
Yeah, I mean, supervision can be extremely rewarding, but it's also one of the sources of a lot of professional pain. Meaning, if you've got a poor supervision relationship, if you have many supervisees and you are not able to manage them, it can be extremely draining. And the truth is that one of the reasons why I wrote the book was because supervisors and every academic, we're very busy. We don't necessarily have time to read 10,000 words on the history of supervision. For most of us, we need tools. And so when I set up to write the book, I'm like, okay, what are the basics? And then what are the things that could go off the rails? But the idea is just to give people a broad overview of a lot of different, very typical experiences, some not so typical experiences, to continually support the idea that you have choice. A supervisor does not just have to fill in the blanks. And I like people to feel intentional and structured in what they do, but also creative. And one of the biggest, challenges in supervision is when there's a breakdown in the supervision relationship. And even the best supervisors can experience this kind of a breakdown. And when that happens, guess what? There are things that can be done. Now we have a duty as educators to educate our students, but if there's a supervision breakdown, I think we have a duty to find someone else to support them in that regard, which means our professional practice means an extremely competent and comprehensive handover. If you are a graduate supervisor and you are not necessarily managing your load of supervision, there's three things that can happen. Everybody can suboptimally continue, right? Things can get worse or things can get very worse. And so if we are being deliberate and pausing and assessing what's going on, we can pivot, we can make choices that are better for our students and better for ourselves. I always say that if a student starts a supervision and the supervisor hasn't explained the next 5 years of their life to them, there's a missing conversation there. How you start is how you should go on. So if you mean to go on with transparency and professionalism, begin that way.
That is such good advice. You've worked across many institutions in several countries. I'm sure you've seen a few things that are generally true. So what would you like to see universities do in order to improve supervision practice?
So that's a great question. If I could just preface this by saying one thing. I think that in the academic world, in particular the unionized academic world, there is a disinclination from many faculty associations to be told what to do. However, with that said, I will say that institutions who value supervision and the shepherding of future knowledge workers in our society could do a couple of things right out of the gate that would make sense. The first thing is that I think that it would be extremely important for institutions to create graduate councils. I don't think you should expect people to supervise out of the gate without training. I also don't think that you should expect people to supervise ongoing without important feedback. So having a tool, a peer tool, to work on not only supporting people to gain the skills to start supervision, but to have that valuable peer feedback where if you're a new supervisor, you've got someone who's giving you evaluation. So the idea of doing that is extremely time consuming for the supervision mentor, which is why I value the co-supervision model. I think if co-supervision is an opportunity, and many institutions don't even allow that option, then you can pair junior supervisors with senior supervisors, and it just becomes an opportunity for learning. But one of the other things that institutions can do is they can start professional development with a new faculty member. If you've got a tenure track faculty member coming in, and there are expectations of teaching and research and service. Well, in those three little buckets, supervision doesn't always land softly. It can be considered a kind of teaching. It can be considered a kind of service. And I wouldn't consider it research, so to speak, but it does impact research, especially if you're in a lab environment, if you're bringing students on to forward your work. So recognize supervision in the workload, please. When we have an actual space for supervision, then not only do we have a space for recognizing good supervisors, we have a space for recognizing people who don't supervise. And I'll say this as someone who's worked in many different collectives. And I've said this at the beginning of our talk today. The benefit of being a poor supervisor is you don't have to supervise because students don't want your supervision and you're not asked to because the outcome is negative. The benefit of being a good supervisor is everybody wants you to be their supervisor, which is not sustainable. It is not sustainable. So having things like graduate councils where you can talk really, really intelligently about workload capacity and understanding what kind of gaps there are. The other part about having a graduate council of some kind is that academics then create that community of support and collegiality where they can start to talk to each other and ask questions. We do have a lot of service work in academics in the academy that is not necessarily recognized as extremely impactful. But if individual departments had a senior supervisor who was there to help new faculty members come in to learn some of these tools and importantly, the institutional requirements. If you just want to come in and tell people when to fill out forms, that's a very, I would say, low impact form of supervision. If you're there to create the next leader in the field, you're going to be networking and creating professional development opportunities and publishing with the students. So there's no one way to do it, but I think that the way that you do it well is you do it intentionally and structured. And that does involve institutional structure. So we need the ability for supervisors not to be on their own and not to be out in the wind and not to only address supervision issues when there's breakdown. So we can get ahead of this in a lot of ways by elevating the practice, by supporting skill building. And that is not something that's hard to do. I mean, I've given many different training sessions with supervisors who have been in the academy for 20 years. And the main comment I get is, why didn't anyone tell me this? So we can learn this, we can get better at this, and then we can have more in our toolkits so that we can make choices rather than default to the only thing that we know.
Well, Katerina, thank you so much for that. I feel like we have only scratched the surface of the complexity of research supervision, but you've done a fantastic job of outlining the skills that are involved, some of the pitfalls, and also what can be done to address them and build a more solid supervisory culture kind of across an institution. So thank you so much for your time today. It's been terrific.
My pleasure, Eliza. It was nice to talk to you.
Wow. I am even more impressed by the academics who go through the PhD journey. There is just so much to consider. What I think Katerina did so well in her explanations in our conversation was separating out the elements of the skill set required for graduate supervision, highlighting the relational and interpretive skills rather than technical skills. It's not surprising that skills such as listening, setting expectations, clear communication, emotional intelligence, and boundary setting are essential to keep the supervisor-supervisee relationship on track through years of intense work. But equally, not so unexpected that these are not always articulated and developed. Even when the quality of supervision has deep impact on a candidate's confidence, well-being, and future career, and PhD completions are a key metric for the supervisor's own job attainment and promotion. Given that, as Katerina said, it's often about judgement rather than rules, I can see how valuable a structured, intentional process is to keeping the candidate on track to completion. Another element that really stood out for me was the importance of structure, community and collegiality to supervisors' skill development, and how universities could be more intentional about that by championing co-supervision and professional development, or implementing initiatives such as support groups, that monthly supervision cafe that Katerina described, or graduate councils. So I hope you found inspiration and practical tips for your own supervision journey. If you would like more advice and insight from campus contributors around the world on this topic, you can check out our latest spotlight, Research Supervision that Supports and Inspires. You'll find it at timeshighereducation.com/campus. And that's all for this episode of Campus Talks. If you enjoyed the podcast, please like, share and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.